What if WHIS invaded Warhammer 40k? When WHIS opened his eyes, he realized something impossible. This was not his universe. The fabric of reality here felt wrong, like standing on ground that screamed beneath your feet. Around him stretched a world of ash and iron, where towers of rust pierced clouds the color of old blood. In the distance, something massive moved through the smoke. Not walked, not flew. It crawled, leaving trails of corruption that burned the air itself. For the first time in billions of years, WHIS felt something unfamiliar stirring at the edge of his consciousness. Not fear, never fear, but curiosity laced with something darker. Whatever lived here was screaming, all of it, at once, forever. The battlefield stretched for miles in every direction, a graveyard of metal and meat where the dead outnumbered the living 1,000 to 1. WHIS floated above the carnage, his staff held loosely in one hand, violet eyes scanning the devastation with clinical interest. Below him, armored warriors the size of small vehicles fired weapons that tore reality apart with each trigger pull. They fought against creatures that should not exist, things made of teeth and hunger, bleeding colors that had no names, shrieking in frequencies that carved symbols into the minds of anyone who heard them. The warriors died screaming prayers to something called the Emperor. The creatures died laughing. Neither side seemed to care that death meant nothing here. The war just continued, feeding on itself, a machine of suffering that ran on the fuel of its own horror. WHIS descended slowly, his movements graceful even in this place of brutal chaos. As his feet touched the scorched earth, the ground beneath him began to change. Flowers bloomed in a perfect circle, delicate and impossible, their petals the soft blue of a peaceful sky. They died within seconds, withering to black ash as the corruption of this world reasserted itself. He watched this happen with mild interest, tilting his head like a curious bird observing something it had never encountered before. In his universe, life persisted because order was the natural state of things. Here, order was the intruder. Violence was the foundation, suffering was the architecture, death was merely the wallpaper that covered everything else. This was a universe built backwards, inside out, screaming at its own existence. A sound cut through the gunfire, not louder, deeper. It came from beneath the world, from inside the spaces between atoms, a whisper that traveled through dimensions WHIS had never sensed before. He paused, genuinely intrigued now. In his home reality, he could perceive 17 dimensions simultaneously, could see time as a river he walked beside, could sense the heartbeat of creation itself. But this was something else entirely, an ocean of pure emotion and madness, pressed up against reality like a hand against glass, waiting for the moment when the barrier would crack. It called itself many things. It wore 10,000 faces. It was hungry in ways that transcended hunger. The mortals here called it the Warp, and WHIS understood immediately why they screamed when they spoke its name. Before he could investigate further, the air split open, not figuratively. The atmosphere tore like wet paper, and through the wound stepped something that defied description. It stood 12 feet tall, its flesh the purple red of infected organs, muscles writhing beneath skin that seemed to breathe independently. Horns spiraled from a skull that was too long, too sharp, filled with too many teeth arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive. It carried a sword made of brass and screaming faces, and when it spoke, the words came from everywhere at once. "New soul," it growled, and the syllables tasted of copper and burning hair. "You reek of order, of law, of the corpse god's lies." The demon took a step forward, and where its hoof touched ground, the earth turned to diseased meat. "I am Khazar the Eternal, champion of the blood god, and your skull will adorn my lord's throne." WHIS regarded the creature with the same expression he might give an interesting insect. No fear registered in his eyes, no anger, just pure, analytical curiosity. "Fascinating," he said softly, his voice carrying perfectly despite the chaos around them. "You exist outside the normal parameters of matter. You're sustained by, what? Emotion? Belief? Some form of psychic resonance I'm not familiar with." He tapped his staff against the ground once, and the sound rang out like a bell made of stars. The demon lunged, its massive blade cutting an arc through space-time itself, fast enough to bisect planets, powerful enough to split atoms with its passing. WHIS moved his head 3 inches to the left. The blade passed through empty air. The demon stumbled, confused, its limited consciousness unable to process what had just happened. How had something so small moved so casually through space that should have been unmovable? WHIS reached out with one finger and touched the demon's chest. Not hard, barely a tap. But in that instant of contact, something fundamental happened. The creature's essence, that churning mass of warp energy that gave it form and function, simply stopped existing. Not destroyed, not banished, erased. The concept of it was removed from local reality as cleanly as wiping writing from a chalkboard. The demon didn't even have time to scream. It was there, and then it wasn't, as if it had never been at all. The warp itself rippled in response, a shockwave of confusion and rage spreading through dimensions that mortal minds couldn't perceive. Somewhere in the spaces between spaces, something vast and ancient turned its attention toward this impossibility. A being that existed beyond the warp's laws had just entered the game. The galaxy would never be the same. WHIS looked at his finger, then at the space where the demon had stood, then up at the blood-red sky where shapes moved behind clouds of industrial smoke. He smiled, that gentle expression he wore when Universe 7's mortals did something particularly interesting during their brief, violent lives. "I see," he said to no one in particular. His words carried on winds that had forgotten what clean air tasted like. This universe operates on violence as its foundation, not as a symptom, as the fundamental law. He began walking forward, staff clicking against metal and bone, flowers briefly blooming and dying in his footsteps. How wonderfully grim, how perfectly, irredeemably broken. Around him, the war continued. 1,000,000 souls cried out in agony every second. 1,000,000,000 more would join them tomorrow. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, ancient powers were awakening to investigate the blue-skinned angel who had just rewritten their rules. If you want to see what happens when perfect order meets perfect chaos, subscribe and join me on this journey into the Grimdark, because what comes next will shake the foundations of the 41st millennium itself. 3,000 light-years away, in the heart of holy terror, something impossible happened. The Astronomicon flickered. For exactly 0.3 seconds, that great psychic beacon that guided humanity through the darkness stuttered like a candle in wind that had no right to exist. 10,000 psychers bound to the golden throne screamed in perfect unison, their voices harmonizing into a single note of metaphysical terror. They had felt something enter the galaxy, not through the warp, not through real space, through a door that shouldn't exist, from a place that had no coordinates, carrying an essence that made the immaterium itself recoil in confusion. The choir of souls burned a fraction brighter for that instant, their life force consumed faster to compensate for the disturbance. 3 of them died on the spot, their minds simply giving up when confronted with the mathematical impossibility of WHIS existence. Their bodies were removed within minutes. Fresh psychers took their place within the hour. The Imperium's most sacred machine never stopped feeding. In the Tower of Hegemon, Custodian General Trajan Valoris stood before a tactical display that showed absolutely nothing useful. Reports flooded in from 17 different sectors, each one contradicting the last. An unknown Xenos entity, a manifested saint, a greater demon of unprecedented form, a Citan shard, a weapon deployed by the Necrons. Nobody agreed on what had entered Imperial space, but everyone agreed on one fundamental truth. It should not exist, and it represented a threat the Imperium had no framework to categorize. Valoris had stood guard over the Emperor for 3 centuries. He had fought demons that wore reality like ill-fitting clothes. He had killed traitor Astartes, who had transcended into godhood. But the readings made no sense. The entity possessed energy signatures beyond any known classification, yet showed no hostility toward Imperial citizens. It had erased a demon with casual ease, yet made no move to advance or conquer. Valoris felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. Across the Imperium, astropaths began receiving the same vision. a figure wreathed in blue and violet, floating above burning worlds, watching with eyes that saw too much and judged too little. He carried a staff topped with a sphere, and around him reality bent like water circling a drain. Some astropaths described him as beautiful, others called him terrifying. A few went mad trying to reconcile the contradiction. The visions came with no words, no demands, no threats, just observation, pure, clinical, impossible observation. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica mobilized immediately, gathering reports, trying to construct a coherent picture from fragments of psychic nightmare. What they assembled looked less like an invasion and more like a cosmic inspection, as if something beyond mortal comprehension had decided to peek behind the curtain of the 41st millennium and take notes on what it found rotting there. On the planet Kratos 9, where WHIS had first appeared, the surviving guardsmen huddled in their bunkers and told stories that would get them executed for heresy if anyone important heard them. They spoke of a blue-skinned angel who had walked through the battlefield like a man strolling through a garden. He had touched a greater demon of Khorne, and the monster had simply ceased to exist, not banished back to the warp, deleted. The veterans among them, men who had fought on 17 different worlds and seen things that would break civilian minds, unanimously agreed on one point. Whatever that being was, it operated on rules that made their universe look like a child's drawing. Commissar Haldane listened to these reports with growing alarm. He should execute them all for speaking of Xenos powers with anything approaching reverence. But something stopped his hand from reaching for his bolt pistol. He had been there, he had seen it too. That perfect circle of flowers blooming and dying. That casual erasure of unstoppable evil. The complete absence of fear or effort. The Inquisition's response was predictably swift and catastrophically fragmented. Ordo Xenos declared the entity a previously unknown alien threat requiring immediate extermination. Ordo Malleus insisted it was a demon prince of unprecedented power, possibly serving a fifth chaos god that had somehow remained hidden until now. Ordo Hereticus argued it might be a blessed saint or fragment of the Emperor's will made manifest. Within 6 hours, 3 different inquisitorial factions had deployed kill teams to Kratos Nint, each with completely contradictory orders. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Xenos arrived first, her retinue armed with weapons designed to kill gods. She found WHIS sitting on a pile of rubble, watching civilian refugees flee through the ruins of their city. He turned to look at her when she approached, his expression mild and curious, like a teacher waiting to hear a student's answer. She raised her plasma pistol, charged to maximum, finger trembling on the trigger. "Identify yourself, Xenos filth." WHIS smiled. "I'm just visiting." That smile should not have been disarming. This was a universe where kindness was a weapon, where mercy was a trap, where every gesture of peace concealed a knife aimed at your spine. Covenant had lived 70 years, learning to trust nothing and suspect everything. Yet when WHIS smiled, she saw no deception, no hidden agenda, no malice at all, just genuine, peaceful curiosity. Her training screamed at her to fire. Her instincts, honed across decades of hunting horrors that wore human faces, begged her to lower the weapon. She compromised by keeping it aimed at his head while taking 3 steps backward. "You destroyed a greater demon," she said, her voice steady despite the conflict raging in her mind. "You appeared from nowhere. You emit energy signatures that break our instruments. You are either the greatest threat this sector has ever faced, or—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Or what? A savior? This was Warhammer 40,000. There were no saviors, only different flavors of damnation. We stood, brushing dust from his robes with movements that seemed choreographed by the universe itself. Every gesture was economical, perfect, containing not a single wasted motion. "I'm neither threat nor salvation," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the distant sounds of artillery fire. "I'm simply someone who found himself in an unfamiliar place, observing unfamiliar rules. You build your civilization on suffering. You feed your god machine with souls. You teach your children that life's purpose is to die screaming the correct name." He tilted his head, studying her the way a scientist might study a fascinating bacteria culture. In my experience, universes that operate this way tend to collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, yet yours persists. I'm curious why. Covenant felt her grip on the plasma pistol tighten. Every word he spoke was technically accurate, which somehow made it worse than any heresy she'd ever heard. He described the Imperium's fundamental truths with the casual detachment of someone reading items off a shopping list. Before she could respond, the sky split open again, but this time, what emerged was worse than any demon. The warp tore wide, and through the wound stepped 3 figures that radiated pure, distilled malevolence. Lesser demons of Tzeentch, their bodies constantly shifting, eyes multiplying and dividing across flesh that couldn't decide what shape it wanted to be. They spoke in unison, their voices layered like a choir singing different songs simultaneously. The Architect of Fate extends his invitation. Come to the Crystal Labyrinth, strange one. Come speak with the Changer of Ways. He has seen your arrival. He has calculated 9,000 futures where you remain, 8,000 where you depart, 1,000 where you burn. He wishes to discuss which future you will choose. The demons grinned with mouths that appeared and disappeared across their forms. Our Lord so rarely finds beings he cannot predict. You have become his favorite game piece. Around them, reality warped and twisted, space folding in on itself like origami made of screaming mathematics. WHIS' expression didn't change, but his eyes, those violet eyes that saw too much, narrowed ever so slightly. The Chaos Gods had noticed him. The game was about to get significantly more interesting. WHIS looked at the Tzeentchian demons with the same polite interest he might show a street performer doing card tricks. Behind him, Inquisitor Covenant was already backing away, her training screaming that proximity to these creatures meant corruption, madness, and damnation in that exact order. Her hand moved in practiced gestures, activating the hexagrammic wards tattooed into her skin, psychic barriers that had protected her from demon princes and sorcerer lords. They flared with golden light and immediately shattered. The demons weren't even trying to corrupt her, they simply existed at a frequency that made her defenses irrelevant, like using a knife to block a tsunami. She felt her thoughts beginning to spiral, patterns appearing in the chaos, equations that whispered terrible truths about the universe's fundamental mathematics. Then WHIS raised one hand, and the effect stopped. Not blocked, simply declined to continue. The demon's influence slid off an invisible barrier around him, and that barrier extended to include her. She gasped, tasting clean air for the first time in what felt like hours, but had only been seconds. The lead demon's form stabilized into something almost humanoid, though its skin rippled with colors that didn't exist in normal spectrums, and its eyes multiplied across its face in Fibonacci spirals. Interesting, it chirped, its voice simultaneously childlike and ancient. You exist outside causality, outside fate, outside the great ocean's currents. We cannot see your past. We cannot calculate your future. You're a blank page in a universe where every book has already been written. The demon gestured, and the air filled with crystalline structures, each one containing a frozen moment of possible futures. Covenant saw herself dying in 1,000 different ways, executed for heresy, consumed by demons, aged to dust, ascending to demonhood herself. Each crystal showed a different path, all equally real, all waiting to become actual. This is what we are, the demon said. We are change, we are possibility, we are the infinite paths that could be. But you have no paths at all. You simply are. Our master finds this delicious. WHIS walked closer to the crystalline structures, examining them with genuine curiosity. He reached out and touched one, showing Covenant being torn apart by cultists. The crystal shattered, and that future simply ceased to exist as a possibility. He touched another, showing her becoming an Inquisitor Lord. It too dissolved into nothing. One by one, he casually erased potential timelines with the same ease someone might pop soap bubbles. The demons watched this display with expressions that cycled through confusion, anger, fascination, and back to confusion every few seconds. Fate is interesting, WHIS said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than destroying the fundamental fabric of Tzeentch's power. In my universe, I serve someone who can see all possible futures, but those futures exist as information, not as binchois. Ding contracts. The difference, I think, is that your master treats possibility as destiny. We treat it as suggestion. He turned to face the demons fully. So tell your architect I decline his invitation. I don't play games where the rules were written before I arrived. The demons' reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Their forms exploded into pure warp energy, shrieking in languages that predated human speech, casting bolts of mutating fire that could turn planets inside out. The attacks hit WHIS's position with enough force to level a city. The ground vaporized, the air turned to plasma. Reality itself screamed at the violation of its physical laws. When the light faded and the dust settled, WHIS stood in the exact same position, completely untouched. He hadn't raised a shield, hadn't dodged, hadn't even acknowledged the attack. The energy had simply decided not to affect him, as if the concept of harm had taken one look at this blue-skinned angel and quietly excused itself from the premises. The demons stared, their many eyes wide with something they rarely experienced, genuine surprise. In the warp, Tzeentch himself paused his eternal scheming for precisely 0.7 seconds, recalculating everything he thought he understood about this new piece on the board. WHIS sighed, a small sound of disappointment that somehow carried across the devastated battlefield. Your master sent you to intimidate me with displays of power, he said, his tone carrying the same gentle patience a teacher might use with struggling students. But power, without purpose, is just noise. In Universe 7, I've watched mortal warriors transcend their limits through training and willpower. I've seen gods fall because they relied on strength alone. Your chaos gods are powerful, yes, impossibly so by this universe's standards, but they're still bound by rules. He tapped his staff against the ground, and the sound resonated across dimensions mortals couldn't perceive. They need worship, they need emotion, they need the warp to exist. Take away their food source, and they starve. That's not true divinity. That's parasitism wearing a crown. The words were delivered without malice, without judgment, just clinical observation, which somehow made them cut deeper than any insult ever could. The demons began to destabilize, their forms flickering like bad transmissions. Being this close to WHIS was antithetical to their existence. He radiated pure order, not the rigid tyrannical order of the Imperium, but something more fundamental, mathematical certainty, logical progression, cause and effect flowing in proper sequence. The warp thrived on chaos, on emotion overwhelming reason, on reality bending to the whims of belief and madness. WHIS represented the opposite extreme, a being so ordered that his mere presence made their chaotic nature difficult to maintain. The lead demon managed one final message before its form collapsed entirely. The architect sees 9,000 futures. In 8,000, you leave this galaxy unchanged. In 1,000, you try to fix it and fail. In 900 of those, you die. In the remaining 100, you become something worse than us. There is no path where you save anyone. This universe is already damned. The daemon smiled with a mouth that unzipped across its entire torso. Welcome to the Grimdark, Angel. Hope you enjoy the show. Then they were gone, banished not by holy power or psychic might, but simply by proximity to something their nature couldn't tolerate. WHIS stood alone in the crater where a city street had been, Covenant unconscious at his feet from psychic shock. Around them, the battle continued. Guardsmen died screaming the Emperor's name. Cultists died laughing prayers to dark gods. Demons manifested and were banished and manifested again in endless cycles. The war machine kept turning, feeding on itself, a perpetual motion engine powered by suffering and faith. WHIS looked up at the blood-red sky, at the distant shape of drop pods descending, at the purple-black clouds where more demons waited to emerge. He had faced destroyers of universes. He had stood beside gods of destruction. He had witnessed the end of timelines and the birth of new realities. But this was something different, not more powerful, just more broken. A universe that had long ago given up on salvation and learned to worship its own suffering instead. He knelt beside Covenant, checking her vital signs with gentle precision. She would live, her mind would recover, but she would never forget what she'd witnessed today. The demons, the casual erasure of fate, the terrible implication that even Tzeentch himself was bound by rules that WHIS existed outside of. She would file her report, and the Inquisition would debate and argue and probably declare her touched by the warp. In a few months, they might execute her just to be safe. That was how this universe worked. It punished survivors. It rewarded martyrdom. It had turned cynicism into a survival strategy and hope into heresy. WHIS gently picked her up, cradling her unconscious form as he began walking toward the evacuation shelters where civilians huddled in prayer. He could leave, right now, step back through whatever cosmic door had brought him here and return to Universe 7 where things made sense. But something kept his feet moving forward, not obligation, not heroism, just curiosity. He wanted to understand how a universe this broken continued to exist. What force was strong enough to hold together an empire built on 10,000 years of continuous, escalating nightmare? Terra, the throne world, humanity's cradle turned into its gilded cage. WHIS appeared in orbit without ceremony or warning, simply stepping from one location to another as if distance was a polite suggestion he chose to ignore. Below him stretched a planet that had forgotten what oceans looked like, where every inch of surface was covered in cathedrals, factories, administrative hives, and the endless machinery of bureaucratic empire. From space, it looked like a tumor made of gold and granite, beautiful and grotesque in equal measure. The Astronomicon blazed at its heart, that psychic lighthouse powered by the screams of 1,000 souls every day, guiding ships through the warp while simultaneously serving as the galaxy's brightest beacon of suffering. WHIS tilted his head, studying the phenomenon with fascination. In his universe, gods didn't require fuel, they simply were. Here, divinity ran on a currency of agony. He wondered if anyone had ever stopped to question whether salvation should cost quite this much. The response was instantaneous. Alarms screamed through the imperialist palace. Defense lasers that could crack moons tracked his position, but held fire on orders from someone with enough authority to overrule automated defenses. 3 custodian guard vessels materialized from the shadows of Luna, their golden hulls bristling with weapons designed to kill everything from greater demons to primarchs. They formed a triangle around WHIS's position, energy signatures charging, void shields at maximum. Inside the lead vessel, Shield Captain Tyvar Helvig stared at the tactical display. With growing unease, the entity showed no energy signature, no heat, no radiation, no gravitational distortion. It simply occupied space, and every instrument they pointed at it returned the same message. Error, does not compute, recalibrate sensors. He'd fought for 3 centuries. He'd killed traitor Astartes who had drunk deep of the warp's power. He'd stood in the Emperor's presence and felt that overwhelming psychic weight. But this was something new, something wrong, something that made his transhuman instincts scream warnings his rational mind couldn't quite articulate. WHIS ignored the warships and descended through Terra's atmosphere, passing through defense grids that frantically tried to decide whether to classify him as aircraft, demon, or natural phenomenon. He landed in the Himalaysian Plateau, exactly 7 miles from the Eternity Gate, the entrance to the inner palace where the Golden Throne resided. The ground beneath his feet was ancient stone, worn smooth by 10,000 years of pilgrims who came to pray at humanity's holiest site. Flowers bloomed in that familiar circle around him, small purple blossoms that lasted 3 full seconds before the pollution in the air killed them. It was progress. This planet's corruption worked slower than the battlefield world. Small victories. Around him, the landing platforms and observation towers erupted into chaos. Servitors sparked and died, their limited programming unable to process what they were seeing. Tech priests fell to their knees, chanting prayers to the Omnissiah, convinced they were witnessing either a miracle or the ultimate machine heresy. WHIS paid them no attention. His gaze was fixed on the massive golden doors 7 miles distant, and beyond them to the thing that sat dying on its throne of torment. The Custodes arrived in force, 300 of the Emperor's finest warriors, each one a demigod in golden armor, each one capable of conquering worlds single-handedly. They formed a perfect circle around WHIS, guardian spears pointed inward, storm shields raised, every movement synchronized with the precision of a machine designed solely for war. Trajan Valoris strode through their ranks, his massive frame draped in a cloak of shimmering adamantium scales, the Watcher's axe crackling with barely contained power. He stopped 10 feet from WHIS, close enough to attack, far enough to retreat if necessary. For a long moment, neither spoke. Valoris studied this blue-skinned entity with violet eyes, noting the casual posture, the complete absence of fear, the staff that somehow felt more dangerous than any weapon he'd ever faced. WHIS studied Valoris in return, seeing the genetic modifications, the neural enhancements, the alchemical perfection that made him simultaneously more and less than human. Two beings who existed beyond mortal limits, meeting for the first time in a place where gods bled slowly into machinery. "You will state your purpose," Valoris said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had never needed to repeat a command. "You will identify your origin. You will explain how you bypassed every defense system between here and the outer system. And you will do so now, before I am forced to conclude you represent an existential threat to Holy Terror." His grip on the Watcher's axe tightened fractionally. Around them, 300 custodes shifted their weight, ready to strike as a single organism if their captain gave the word. They could feel it, that same wrongness Helvig had sensed. This being didn't register as demon or xenos or human. It registered as an equation that didn't belong in their universe's mathematics. WHIS met Valoris's gaze. Without flinching, without aggression, without any of the reactions the custodian general had learned to expect from threats both mortal and otherwise. Just calm. Infinite, unshakable calm. The kind of serenity that came from standing at the center of creation and finding it all rather manageable. "My name is WHIS," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind that howled across the Himalaysian peaks. "I serve as attendant and martial arts instructor to Lord Beerus, God of Destruction for Universe 7. I arrived here by accident through a dimensional instability I'm still trying to understand. As for my purpose," he gestured broadly at the golden cityscape surrounding them, "I'm observing. Your civilization is fascinating in its commitment to suffering as organizational principle. You've built an empire on the belief that cruelty is necessary, that hope is dangerous, that the only proper prayer is a scream. I've seen many societies across many universes, but this," he smiled that gentle, curious smile, "this is unique. You've turned nihilism into theology and made it work for 10,000 years. I want to understand how. I want to see the thing that holds all this together." He pointed toward the Eternity Gate, toward the throne beyond. "I want to meet your Emperor." The words landed like artillery shells. Several custodes actually took involuntary steps backward. One made a warding gesture. Valoris' eyes widened fractionally, the first crack in his perfect composure. Requesting an audience with the Master of Mankind was one thing. Demanding to see the Golden Throne itself was heresy of such magnitude that most people wouldn't even conceive of speaking it aloud. "Impossible," Valoris said flatly. "The Emperor is beyond the reach of mortals. He fights in the Great War within the Webway. He holds back the Astronomicon's collapse. He stands as the only bulwark between humanity and extinction. You will never—" He stopped. Because WHIS was no longer standing in front of him. The being had moved, not teleported, not activated any technology, simply chosen to be somewhere else instead. Valoris spun, transhuman reflexes moving faster than thought, and found WHIS now standing at the edge of the custodian circle, looking expectantly at the Golden Warriors, who now had their backs to him. "The problem with fortifications," WHIS said conversationally, "is they only work against beings who respect walls." Before Valoris could give the order to attack, something else happened, something that had never occurred in the entire 10,000-year history of the Imperium's watch over the Golden Throne. A psychic pulse emanated from the inner palace, vast and terrible and unmistakable. It wasn't words, it wasn't images, it was pure intent, compressed into a single directive that every psyker on Terra felt simultaneously. "Let him approach." 300 custodes froze, their training warring with disbelief. Valoris actually staggered, his enhanced mind struggling to process what he'd just experienced. The Emperor, the corpse god, the carrion lord who hadn't spoken to anyone in millennia, who communicated only through the faintest psychic whispers to his Most gifted servants had just issued a direct command. He wanted to meet this impossible being. He wanted to see WHIS. Valoris lowered his axe slowly, every instinct screaming at him that this was wrong, that nothing good could come from allowing an unknown entity near humanity's most sacred and most vulnerable heart. But he had spent 300 years following the Emperor's will. He wouldn't stop now. He stepped aside, the circle parted, and WHIS began walking toward the Eternity Gate, toward the throne, toward a meeting that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of power itself. The Eternity Gate opened for the first time in 3 centuries. 20 stories of adamantium and gold swung inward with the grinding sound of machinery older than most civilizations, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness deeper than any natural shadow. WHIS walked through without hesitation, his footsteps echoing against walls carved with the names of every hero who had ever died in the Emperor's service. There were billions of names, trillions. The walls went up farther than eyes could see, covered in script so small it looked like texture, each letter representing someone who had given everything for a dream that had long ago curdled into nightmare. The custodies followed at a distance, their golden armor dimmed in this sacred darkness, their weapons lowered but ready. They had stood guard over this throne for 10,000 years. They had watched their liege slowly die, day by day, century by century, transforming from a golden god into a withered corpse held together by machinery and will. Now they would watch something impossible walk into his presence. History was being written in real time, and none of them knew whether they were witnessing salvation or the ultimate desecration. The throne room was vast enough to hold continents. Its ceiling disappeared into shadows that might have been actual night sky or might have been something worse. At its center sat the Golden Throne, a monument to humanity's hubris and devotion built during the dark age of technology, modified during the Great Crusade, transformed into a prison during the heresy. It was part life support system, part psychic amplifier, part torture device. 10,000 cables fed into it, carrying the souls of psychers, channeling their life force into the withered thing that sat upon it. The Astronomicon's light blazed at the throne's peak, a psychic scream visible from across the galaxy, and there, beneath that terrible radiance, sat the Emperor of mankind. He was smaller than myth suggested. The golden armor had long ago fused with necrotic flesh. The face was a skull wrapped in parchment skin, but the eyes still burned with intelligence and suffering and terrible, endless purpose. Those eyes turned to regard WHIS as he approached, and the temperature in the throne room dropped 20 degrees from the sheer psychic weight of that gaze. WHIS stopped at the base of the throne, looking up at the Emperor with the same analytical curiosity he'd shown everything else in this universe. No reverence, no fear, just observation. He tilted his head, studying the life support systems, the psychic amplifiers, the soul engines that kept this corpse animated and aware. "Fascinating," he said softly. "You're dying. You've been dying for 10,000 years. Every second is agony beyond mortal comprehension, yet you persist, not through healing, not through regeneration, through sheer refusal to surrender." He tapped his staff against the floor. "In my universe, Lord Beerus once fought an enemy who transcended death itself, but even that being could be destroyed eventually. You've turned dying into an art form. You exist in the space between life and death, maintaining an empire through the example of your suffering. That's not divinity, that's martyrdom weaponized." The words should have resulted in immediate execution. The custodes tensed, ready to strike, but the Emperor raised one skeletal hand, barely a twitch of movement, and they froze. When the Emperor spoke, it wasn't with voice. His vocal cords had rotted away millennia ago. Instead, psychic pressure filled the throne room like water flooding a sealed chamber, pressing against minds and souls, carrying meaning directly into consciousness. The words formed in WHIS' mind, heavy as mountains, sharp as broken glass. "You are not of this reality. I see 17 dimensions. I perceive the warp's infinite madness. I witness every future simultaneously. But you are blank, a void where something should be. Explain yourself." The demand carried the weight of absolute authority, backed by psychic might that had once united a galaxy under singular vision. It was the voice that had commanded Primarchs, that had broken Xenos empires, that had stared into the warp itself and declared no further. It expected obedience. It expected immediate compliance. WHIS met that psychic pressure without flinching, without strain, his serene expression never wavering. The Emperor's power washed over him like water over stone, unable to find purchase, unable to compel. For the first time in 10,000 years, the master of mankind encountered something his will could not dominate. "I already explained to your custodian general," WHIS said calmly. "I serve Lord Beerus as attendant and teacher. I arrived here by accident. As for why you cannot perceive me properly," he smiled. "Angels exist outside causality in ways even gods don't fully understand. We move through time. We perceive futures. We can rewind moments that have already occurred. Your psychic sight is impressive by local standards, but it's still bound by this universe's rules. I operate under different mathematics." He paused, considering. "Though I admit, your persistence is remarkable. You're maintaining a psychic lighthouse visible across the galaxy, while simultaneously fighting a war in some kind of tunnel dimension, while also keeping your body alive through technology and will alone. That's extraordinarily inefficient, but the sheer determination required is noteworthy. Most beings would have accepted death millennia ago. You choose torture instead. Why?" The question was genuine, curious, without mockery. WHIS truly wanted to understand what drove a god to become a perpetual sacrifice. The Emperor's psychic presence shifted, something like surprise rippling through the mental pressure. 10,000 years ago, my favored son betrayed me. He crippled my body, trapped me here. I could have died, should have died. But if I die, the Astronomicon fails. The warp consumes terror. Humanity drowns in eternal darkness, so I endure. Every second is torture beyond mortal comprehension. Every moment, I fight demons in the webway. Every heartbeat, I hold the Imperium together through sheer refusal to surrender. The psychic voice grew heavier, colder. "I am not martyrdom. I am necessity. This galaxy requires suffering to function. The warp feeds on emotion. Chaos grows strong on hope and despair alike. The only defense is rigid order, absolute control, endless sacrifice. I am the ultimate sacrifice, and my suffering powers humanity's survival. You call it inefficient. I call it the only path that works." The words carried 10,000 years of bitterness, of watching ideals crumble, of learning that every attempt to elevate humanity only fed the darkness it tried to escape. WHIS was quiet for a long moment, processing this. When he spoke again, his tone was softer, almost gentle. "You built an empire on the principle that suffering is necessary, that hope is dangerous, that the only way to survive is through endless, grinding misery, and it's worked. Your Imperium has lasted 10 millennia through the most hostile environment imaginable. That's a genuine achievement." He paused. "But I've seen this pattern before, in different forms. Civilizations that mistake survival for victory, that confuse persisting with thriving. You've created a machine that runs on agony, and you've placed yourself at its heart as the ultimate fuel source. But machines like that have a problem." His violet eyes met the Emperor's burning gaze directly. "They can't ever stop, can't ever change, can't ever heal. Because the moment the suffering ends, the moment someone suggests there might be another way, the entire structure collapses. You're not holding the Imperium together, you're holding yourself hostage, and everyone else along with you. Your son's betrayal didn't just cripple your body, it locked you into a philosophy where pain is the only honest currency." The throne room grew deathly silent. The custodes stood frozen, unable to believe someone had just accused the Emperor of being complicit in his own damnation. The psychic pressure intensified, reality warping around the golden throne, the air crackling with power that could unmake worlds. "I have lived 40,000 years. I have guided humanity since before recorded history. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have fought gods and monsters, and you who arrived in my universe mere hours ago dare lecture me on philosophy." The rage was palpable, ancient, the fury of a being who had sacrificed everything and was now being told it might have been unnecessary. The Astronomicon flared brighter, 10,000 psychers screaming as more power was drawn through them. But WHIS stood unmoved, his calm absolute, his staff planted firmly on golden floor. "Yes," he said simply, "because sometimes the oldest beings are the most trapped by their own perspective. You've been dying for so long, you've forgotten what living looks like. And now you're teaching an entire species to mistake eternal war for inevitable truth." The words hung in the air like executioner's blades. The meeting between cosmic powers had become a battle not of strength, but of worldviews, and neither side was willing to yield. The Emperor's rage subsided slowly, like a storm deciding whether to continue or disperse. The psychic pressure eased enough that the custodes could breathe again, though their hands remained locked on their weapons. When the Master of Mankind spoke again, his mental voice carried something unexpected. Curiosity. "You speak as if there are alternatives, as if this galaxy could function differently." The words were heavy with skepticism earned through 40 millennia of witnessing every idealistic dream shatter against reality's cruelest truths. "I tried peace. The age of strife proved. Peace is temporary. I tried enlightenment. My own sons fell to darkness. I tried hope. It feeds chaos as surely as despair. So I built what works, suffering contained, violence directed, faith weaponized. If you know another way, stranger from beyond, then speak it, but know that I have already tried every option you can imagine, and failed." The admission carried the weight of millennia, each failed experiment a scar on consciousness that refused to fade. WHIS walked slowly along the base of the throne, studying the machinery, the cables, the soul engines that turned human life into fuel. "In Universe 7, he began, his voice thoughtful, "we had a mortal named Goku who achieved power that rivaled gods through nothing but training and determination. No genetic engineering, no psychic might, just pure effort, elevated to its highest expression. He nearly destroyed the universe several times through sheer reckless strength." WHIS smiled at the memory. "Lord Beerus wanted to destroy his planet for this. I suggested teaching him control instead. The result? A mortal who could fight gods, who could push past every limit, who maintained his compassion even when wielding universe-ending power." He turned to face the Emperor directly. "Your philosophy says such things are impossible, that power corrupts, that hope feeds darkness, but I've witnessed the opposite. The difference isn't the power itself, it's the context in which it grows. You built an empire that teaches humanity to fear its own potential. Then you wonder why that potential turns dark." Pretty words. The Emperor's response was sharp, cutting, "But this is not your universe. The warp exists here. Emotion becomes reality. Belief becomes power. Every hope feeds Tzinch. Every martial pride feeds Khorne. Every indulgence feeds Slanesh. Every despair feeds Nurgle. Your mortal hero would last exactly 3 seconds before chaos claimed him. His psychic presence expanded, showing WHIS visions. Heroes who fell. Saints who became demons, warriors who conquered galaxies in righteousness only to drown in their own corruption. 10,000 years of evidence that hope was poison, that kindness was weakness, that the only defense against darkness was darker pragmatism. You see broken philosophy, I see painful survival. The visions intensified, showing worlds burning, populations enslaved, entire systems sacrificed to buy humanity one more century of existence. This is what compassion costs in the 41st millennium. Extinction. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. WHIS absorbed the visions without flinching, processing information with the clinical detachment of someone who had witnessed the destruction and rebirth of entire universes. "You're not wrong," he admitted, surprising everyone in the throne room. "Your warp is genuinely unique. A dimension where emotion becomes weaponized reality, where enough belief can reshape physics itself, where gods are born from collective suffering. That's dangerous in ways my home universe doesn't experience." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But you've made one critical error in your analysis. You assume the warp's nature is fixed, unchangeable, that because it currently feeds on suffering, it must always feed on suffering. That's fatalism masquerading as wisdom." He raised his staff and something impossible happened. The Astronomicon's light flickered, not dimmed, not failed, just paused as if someone had pressed pause on a recording of reality itself. The Emperor's consciousness froze mid-thought. The custodes became statues. The machinery stopped grinding. Time itself held its breath. Only WHIS remained in motion, walking through a throne room where seconds had simply declined to continue happening. In that frozen moment, WHIS did something no being in the 41st millennium had ever conceived possible. He reached out, not with his hand but with his awareness, and touched the warp directly, not from this side, where it pressed against reality like an ocean against glass. From the other side, from outside, he perceived it as an angel perceives creation, seeing not what it was, but what it could be. The warp was vast, infinite, a roiling sea of emotion and madness where the four gods ruled as undisputed tyrants. But WHIS saw the deeper truth. The warp wasn't inherently evil, it was a mirror. It reflected what was poured into it. Humanity poured in fear, desperation, violence, and suffering. So the warp became fear, desperation, violence, and suffering. The Chaos Gods weren't the cause of the galaxy's darkness, they were its symptom, its consequence, the ultimate proof that the Emperor's philosophy had created exactly what it feared most. A feedback loop where suffering generated more suffering, eternally with no possible escape. WHIS released his hold on time, reality resumed, the Emperor's consciousness snapped back into awareness, immediately sensing that something fundamental had just occurred. "What did you do?" The mental voice carried shock, the first genuine surprise the master of mankind had experienced in millennia. WHIS returned to his position at the base of the throne, his expression peaceful. "I looked at your warp from outside. I saw its structure, its rules, its possibilities." He met the Emperor's burning gaze. "You're correct that it feeds on emotion, but you're wrong about which emotions. It doesn't feed on hope itself. It feeds on hope twisted by desperation. Not love itself, but love corrupted by possession. Not ambition itself, but ambition divorced from purpose. The Chaos Gods aren't inevitable products of sentient emotion. They're inevitable products of sentient emotion filtered through 10,000 years of trauma, oppression, and institutional cruelty. You didn't create them directly, but your Imperium taught humanity exactly the emotional patterns that would sustain them forever. You built the perfect feeding ground for the enemies you claim to fight." The throne room erupted into chaos, not metaphorical chaos, actual chaos. The warp tore open above the golden throne, reality screaming as something vast pressed against it from the other side. The custodes raised their weapons toward threats they couldn't see, their transhuman senses detecting wrongness on every spectrum. Alarms blared throughout the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's psychic presence exploded outward, fighting to seal the breach, to push back whatever was trying to force its way through. But this wasn't a normal warp incursion. This was different. The four gods had felt what WHIS did, felt him touch their domain from an angle that shouldn't exist, felt him perceive truths they had spent eternity concealing. And now they were responding, not with subtlety, not with schemes, with direct, overwhelming force. Four voices spoke in terrible unison, shaking the foundations of terror itself. "The angel has seen too much. He knows our secret. He understands our weakness. He cannot be allowed to speak it." The warp rift widened. Demons began pouring through, but not lesser demons, greater ones, exalted ones, champions who had won 10,000 wars, each one powerful enough to conquer planets alone. WHIS sighed, a small sound of disappointment in the mounting chaos. "This is the problem with systems built on violence," he said, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the screaming alarms and psychic pressure. "They can only respond to threats with more violence. I make an observation about the warp's true nature, and instead of considering whether I might be correct, you attack. Because if I'm right, it means 10,000 years of suffering could have been avoided. It means the Emperor's great sacrifice might have been..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Unnecessary." The word landed like a nuclear explosion. The Emperor roared psychically, a sound that would have killed unaugmented humans instantly. The custodes charged toward the warp breach, moving with perfect synchronization to hold back the tide of demons flooding through. And WHIS stood at the center of it all, calm and untouched, watching a cosmic tantrum unfold, because he had dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Grimdark didn't have to be quite so grim. The war for Terra's soul had begun, and it started not with invasion, but with a simple, terrible question. What if everything you believed was wrong? The first greater demon through the breach was a bloodthirster named Karvoth, the Eternal Slayer, a legend among legends who had killed 3 chapter masters and destroyed 2 forge worlds. It stood 20 feet tall, wings of burning brass spreading wide enough to cast shadows over entire city blocks, its axe forged from the skulls of 1 billion warriors who had dared challenge Khorne's supremacy. When it roared, the sound shattered windows across the Imperial Palace and made custodes stumble despite their transhuman physiology. It charged at WHIS with speed that defied its massive size, moving faster than bolter rounds, its axe descending in an arc that could split mountains. WHIS watched it come with the same expression someone might wear while observing an interesting cloud formation. The axe hit, not missed, not blocked, hit, made contact with WHIS's shoulder, and stopped. Not because WHIS had raised a shield, not because of armor. The weapon simply declined to continue its trajectory, as if it had struck something the universe itself refused to allow damaged. Karvoth pulled back, confusion spreading across its demonic features. Confusion was not an emotion bloodthirsters experienced often. It struck again and again. Each blow carried enough force to level hab blocks, enough power to crack continent plates. Each blow stopped the instant it touched blue skin, as if WHIS existed in a different set of physical laws where harm was a theoretical concept rather than practical reality. The bloodthirster's rage intensified, feeding back into the warp, drawing more power, growing larger, its axe blazing with flames that could burn souls themselves. It struck with everything it had, channeling the rage of 10,000 battlefields, the fury of 1 million murdered worlds, the collected violence of an entire chaos god focused through one supreme champion. The axe shattered. Not against WHIS, against itself. The weapon couldn't reconcile the contradiction of striking something that refused to acknowledge damage, so it chose the only logical option. It broke. Karvoth stared at the fragments of its legendary weapon, its limited consciousness unable to process this impossibility. WHIS reached out casually and tapped the bloodthirster's chest with one finger, the same gesture he'd used on the lesser demon days ago. Karvoth, the Eternal Slayer, scourge of 100 sectors, champion who had endured 10,000 years of endless war, ceased to exist, not banished, not destroyed, simply removed from the equation of reality. Its essence didn't return to the warp to reform. It was gone, erased. The concept of it deleted from local existence as if someone had highlighted its name in the universe's code and pressed delete. In the warp, Khorne felt it. Felt one of his mightiest champions simply vanish, not defeated in battle, but negated like a math error. The blood god's rage shook the immaterium itself, and across 1,000 battlefields, his followers felt an unfamiliar emotion rippling through their connection to their master. Something that might have been concern, or might have been the first taste of fear that Khorne had experienced since his birth. The other demons paused, their limited intelligence processing what they had just witnessed. Then they attacked as one, a tide of horror that should have overwhelmed any defense. Lords of Change wove reality-altering spells that could transform matter into thought. Great unclean ones vomited plagues that could rot adamantium. Keepers of secrets moved with hypnotic grace, their beauty and horror combined to break minds and souls alike. 50 greater demons, each one a strategic level threat, each one capable of ending civilizations, all focused on a single target. The Custodes fought to hold the perimeter, their guardian spears cutting through lesser demons, their storm shields deflecting warp fire, but they couldn't reach the core of the battle. Couldn't intervene in a conflict that operated on scales beyond even their engineered perfection. They could only watch as their understanding of power was systematically deconstructed, as something impossible proved that their legends were quaint fairy tales compared to realities that existed beyond their universe's borders. WHIS moved through the demonic assault like water through gaps in stone, his movements minimal, economical, perfect. A Lord of Change tried to trap him in a paradox spell that would lock him between contradictory states of existence. WHIS stepped sideways through a dimension the spell couldn't perceive and tapped the demon's head. It erased. A great unclean one wrapped him in entropy fields designed to age matter into dust. WHIS stood within the field, completely unaffected. and touched the demon's bloated stomach. Erasure. A keeper of secrets attempted psychic seduction, promising pleasures beyond mortal comprehension, offering knowledge that would elevate him beyond angelic status. WHIS listened politely, then gently poked its forehead. Gone. One by one, greater demons that had terrorized the Gal. Axii for millennia simply stopped existing, not through violence, not through superior power, through something more fundamental. WHIS existed in a state where their rules didn't apply. They were playing chess while he existed in a reality where the concept of game boards was optional. The Emperor watched from his throne, unable to intervene directly without abandoning his vigil over the Astronomicon and dooming terror to warp immersion. His psychic presence filled the throne room, analyzing, calculating, trying to understand what he was witnessing. This wasn't power in any conventional sense. The stranger wasn't stronger than the demons. He simply operated under different axioms of existence. The chaos entities drew strength from the warp, were bound by its rules, could be fought using its logic. WHIS existed perpendicular to those rules. He was mathematics from a different textbook being inserted into an equation that had no variables to accommodate him. If you can do this, the Emperor's mental voice carried desperate urgency. If you possess this power, then help us. End chaos, seal the warp, save humanity from 10,000 years of suffering. The plea was raw, unguarded, the first moment of genuine vulnerability the master of mankind had shown since his internment. If this being could erase greater demons with a touch, perhaps he could erase the chaos gods themselves. WHIS stopped moving, standing in the center of a circle of golden floor that had become scorched black from demonic presence. Around him, the remaining demons hesitated, their limited consciousness beginning to grasp that attack was futile. WHIS looked up at the Emperor, his violet eyes carrying something that might have been sympathy. "I can't," he said simply. The two words landed heavier than any demonic assault. The Chaos Gods aren't invaders you can eliminate. They're not foreign entities corrupting your universe from outside. They are your universe. Or at least, they're what your universe has become after 40,000 years of evolution shaped by sentient suffering. He gestured at the warp breach, at the malevolent presence pressing through from the other side. They were born from emotion. They're sustained by emotion. And as long as sentient life exists in this galaxy, as long as creatures capable of feeling exist in proximity to the warp, they will exist. I could erase every demon in existence right now, every single one, and in a year they'd be back, because nothing would have changed about the conditions that create them. The throne room fell silent except for the grinding of ancient machinery and the distant screams of psychers feeding the Astronomicon. The custodes stood frozen, weapons lowered, unable to process what they had just heard. The Emperor's psychic presence contracted, pulling inward, the weight of realization crushing down on consciousness that had carried the Imperium's hopes for 10 millennia. Then, there is no solution. The words were hollow, empty, the sound of a being confronting the ultimate futility of its existence. No hope, no victory, only endless maintenance of inevitable collapse. WHIS shook his head slowly. No, there's a solution. It's just not the one you want to hear. He pointed at the golden throne, at the Emperor's withered form. You need to die. Actually die. Let the Imperium collapse. Let humanity face the full horror of what they've become without your protection. And then maybe, if they survive the fires, they'll rebuild into something that doesn't feed the darkness quite so efficiently. But that requires accepting that 10,000 years of sacrifice was not heroism. It was postponement. You didn't save humanity. You preserved it in amber while the rot spread beneath the surface. The words were a death sentence, a heresy so profound that merely speaking it should have been impossible, and WHIS delivered them with the gentle sadness of a teacher watching a brilliant student refuse to see their own mistakes. The warp breach exploded outward, tearing reality apart like wet paper. The throne room expanded impossibly, its dimensions stretching beyond physical logic, becoming a space where the material and immaterial collided in violent union. The remaining demons scattered, fleeing back into the warp, not in defeat, but in terror, because what came next was beyond even their comprehension. The four Chaos Gods were manifesting directly. not sending avatars, not projecting power through servants, actually manifesting fragments of their infinite consciousness into real space, something they had not done since the war in heaven, something that required such catastrophic expenditure of power that stars across 3 sectors flickered and died to fuel the working. The air became fire, the floor became flesh, the ceiling became screaming faces. And through it all, 4 presences emerged, each one vast beyond mortal understanding, each one carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated suffering, belief, and dark worship. Khorne appeared as an ocean of blood that had learned to think, a tide of endless rage given form and purpose. Not the simple anger of mortals, but rage itself elevated to cosmic principle, the fundamental universal truth that violence resolves all equations eventually. Tzeentch manifested as impossible geometries folding through dimensions that made eyes bleed to perceive, a crystalline intelligence that saw every possible future simultaneously and found them all equally amusing. Nurgle took shape as a garden of beautiful corruption, where death and life blurred together into eternal stagnant transformation, acceptance of decay elevated into philosophy. Slaanesh arrived last, a being of such profound excess that reality itself blushed, beauty and horror so intertwined that the distinction became meaningless, pleasure and pain unified into single transcendent experience. Together they spoke, their voices harmonizing into something that was not sound but pure concept forced directly into consciousness. You would unmake us, angel. You would teach them the secret we have hidden for millennia. WHIS regarded the 4 gods with the same calm he had shown everything else. The Custodes had fallen to their knees, their enhanced minds unable to process direct exposure to beings that existed across dimensions simultaneously. Even the Emperor's psychic presence had contracted, pulling back to maintain the Astronomicon while the throne room became battleground for forces that made Primarchs look like insects. But WHIS stood untouched, unaffected, analyzing these cosmic entities with clinical curiosity. "You're afraid," he said, and the simplicity of the statement was more cutting than any weapon. "Not of me specifically, of what I represent. Proof that your existence isn't inevitable, that a universe can function without parasitic gods feeding on emotion. You've convinced this galaxy that you're fundamental forces of nature, as eternal and unchangeable as gravity or time. But I've seen your birth, I've perceived your origins. You're not ancient beyond measure. In my frame of reference, you're children, powerful children certainly, but children nonetheless, throwing tantrums because someone dared suggest you're not as permanent as you pretend." The 4 gods' unified presence intensified, reality buckling under the weight of their combined attention. Across Terra, 1 billion citizens screamed simultaneously as their minds touched the edge of something too vast to comprehend. "We are eternal," they roared in unison, and planets trembled at their denial. "We existed before the first mortal drew breath. We will exist after the last star dies. We are birthed from emotion itself. While sentience exists, we persist. You cannot kill us. You cannot banish us. You can only delay the inevitable consumption of all things." Khorne surged forward, manifesting an axe the size of continents. Tzeentch wove spells that could rewrite the laws of physics. Nurgle exhaled plagues that could rot concepts themselves. Slaanesh sang notes that promised oblivion disguised as ecstasy. The combined assault carried enough power to unmake solar systems, to crack the galaxy's spine, to end existence itself in this corner of space. It hit WHIS like a tsunami, hitting a mountain that had simply decided tsunamis were beneath its notice. Nothing happened. The power washed over him, around him, through dimensions he occupied that the warp couldn't reach. WHIS remained standing, his expression shifting from calm to something that might have been disappointment. "This is the problem with entities that exist purely through belief and emotion," he said, his voice cutting through the cosmic assault as if it were gentle rain. "You're powerful, yes. Within your sphere of influence, within this galaxy, you're essentially omnipotent, but you're also limited, constrained. You cannot grow beyond what your worshippers imagine. You cannot evolve past what your nature allows. Khorne can never know peace. Tzeentch can never accept stagnation. Nurgle can never embrace vitality. Slaanesh can never find satisfaction." He tapped his staff against the floor, and the sound rang out with perfect clarity despite the chaos. You're trapped in your own definitions, perfect examples of power without freedom, and you're terrified that if anyone realizes this, if mortals understand that you're just as imprisoned as they are, your hold will break. The assault ceased. The four gods pulled back slightly, their unified presence regarding WHIS with something that transcended hate or fear, with recognition. They saw in him the same thing he saw in them, a being operating under rules that made normal existence irrelevant. But where they were bound by the warp's logic, he existed outside all logic entirely. The stalemate was absolute. They could not harm him. He would not harm them. "You understand nothing," Tzeentch's voice separated from the chorus, sharp and crystalline. "You see our weakness and think you've solved some cosmic riddle, but the real secret, Angel, is simpler and more terrible." The Lord of Change manifested more fully, geometries shifting into something almost humanoid, though its face was a spiral of eyes that calculated infinite probabilities. "This galaxy wants us, needs us. The Imperium creates more of us every day through its cruelty. The Emperor feeds us with his suffering. Humanity sustains us with their fear. We are not the disease, we are the symptom. And you are the cure that will never be administered." The throne room stabilized slightly as the gods' manifestation began to fade. They couldn't maintain direct presence in real space for extended periods without catastrophic consequences, and they had made their point. Nurgle's voice, thick and loving like honey over rot, spoke next. "We have seen every future, little angel. In 998 of 1,000 timelines, you leave this galaxy unchanged. In 2, you try to help and fail spectacularly, creating new horrors in your wake." "The plague." Father chuckled, the sound like bubbling pus. "Your compassion is admirable, your power is impressive, your understanding is accurate, but it changes nothing. This universe is ours, has been ours, will always be ours, not because we conquered it, because it chose us, chose eternal war over temporary peace, chose suffering over vulnerability, chose darkness over the hard work of light." The words carried the weight of 10,000 years of confirmation bias, of a galaxy that had proven the four right at every possible turn. Slaanesh was the last to speak before the gods fully retreated, its voice simultaneously seductive and revolting. "And the most delicious irony, sweet angel, you could prove us wrong, you could stay, teach them your mathematics, show them alternate existence, spend 10,000 years slowly, painfully reshaping this galaxy into something that doesn't feed us." The Dark Prince giggled, the sound making the air taste of copper and roses. "But you won't, because you're not a savior, you're a tourist, an observer. You said it yourself, you're just visiting. And when your curiosity is satisfied, you'll return to your clean universe where gods don't feast on agony, and you'll leave these mortals to drown in the darkness. We wrap around them like loving blankets. So tell me, who is more cruel? The gods who openly declare their malevolence, or the angel who shows them heaven knowing they'll never reach it?" The question hung in the air like poison. The warp breach sealed. The throne room returned to its normal, impossible dimensions. The Chaos God's presence faded back into the immaterium, their point made, their prophecy delivered. We stood in the center of scorched golden floor, surrounded by custodies who were slowly recovering from exposure to forces that should have annihilated their sanity. The Emperor's psychic presence loomed heavy, processing everything that had just occurred, everything that had been said. The silence was deafening, more crushing than any assault, because Slaanesh had spoken the truth that cut deeper than any weapon, which had the power to help, the knowledge to save them, the ability to change everything, but he wouldn't. Not because he was evil, not because he didn't care, but because he was exactly what he claimed to be, a visitor, an observer, someone fascinated by the Grimdark but fundamentally separate from it. He would watch, he would learn, he would understand, and then he would leave, and the 41st millennium would remain exactly as broken as it had always been. The tragedy wasn't that salvation was impossible. The tragedy was that it was possible, and it still wouldn't happen. WHIS stood motionless for exactly 17 seconds, his violet eyes distant, perceiving timelines and possibilities that existed beyond this universe's capacity to observe. The custodes watched him with weapons raised, uncertain whether he was friend, enemy, or something that transcended such simple categories. The Emperor's consciousness pressed against him, not attacking, but probing, trying to understand what calculations were happening behind those alien eyes. When WHIS finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. Slaanesh was right about one thing. I am a tourist. I didn't come here to save you. I came here by accident, and I stayed out of curiosity. Your suffering is fascinating from an academic perspective, but it's not my responsibility. He paused, and for the first time since arriving in the 41st millennium, something like emotion crossed his features. Sadness. Deep, genuine sadness. But that doesn't mean I can simply walk away having changed nothing. So I'm going to give you something. Not salvation, not solutions, just possibility. He turned to face the Golden Throne directly, looking up at the withered God Emperor who had orchestrated humanity's survival through 10,000 years of calculated brutality. You asked me to end chaos. I told you I couldn't. That was accurate but incomplete. I can't end the chaos gods because they're sustained by emotion, and I can't eliminate emotion without eliminating sentience itself. But I can show you what they actually are. Strip away the mystique, the terror, the inevitability. WHIS raised his staff, and the sphere at its tip began to glow with light that existed in colors the human spectrum had no names for. Every mortal in this galaxy has been taught that chaos is eternal, unstoppable, that fighting it is futile, and the best you can do is delay the inevitable. That belief is what gives the Four their strength. It's the foundation of their power. So let me show you something different. Let me show you what gods look like when you stop believing they're invincible. The light expanded, filling the throne room, spreading beyond it, racing across terror at the speed of thought. It touched every mind on the planet simultaneously, from the lowest menial to the High Lords themselves, carrying a single vision. They saw the warp not as mortals perceived it, but as WHIS perceived it. Not as an infinite ocean of malevolence, but as a mirror. A reflection of accumulated trauma, yes, but also a reflection that could change if what it reflected changed. They saw the chaos gods not as eternal forces of nature, but as entities with clear boundaries, definable limits, specific weaknesses. They saw Khorne's dependence on endless war, Tzeentch's addiction to hope twisted into scheming, Nurgle's need for despair masquerading as acceptance, Slaanesh's requirement for sensation divorced from meaning. And most importantly, they saw that these beings were not inevitable in OT. Her timelines in other configurations of history, they need never have existed at all. The revelation didn't destroy faith, it didn't eliminate fear, but it planted something more dangerous than either, a seed of doubt, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the Grimdark wasn't the only option. The Emperor's reaction was immediate and violent. His psychic presence exploded outward, not in attack but in denial, in desperate rejection of what he'd just witnessed. No, this cannot be true. If it were true, if they were this vulnerable, then everything... He couldn't finish the thought, couldn't allow himself to complete the logical chain, because if the Chaos Gods were defeatable, if they were built on belief and sustained by specific emotional patterns, then every sacrifice, every brutal decision, every world burned, every idealist purged, every hope crushed had been unnecessary. Not heroic, not pragmatic, just wrong. 10,000 years of suffering elevated to institutional religion, and it had all been based on a miscalculation, on seeing the enemy as eternal when they were merely persistent, on treating symptoms as causes and causes as unchangeable nature. The Emperor's consciousness writhed, trapped between acknowledging truth and protecting the ideology that had defined his existence for longer than most stars had burned. Across the galaxy, the vision spread. Astropaths transmitted it instinctively, unable to contain knowledge this fundamental. On Cadia, guardsmen fighting their eternal war against chaos suddenly perceived their enemies differently, not as unstoppable evil, but as parasites that could be starved. On Forge Worlds, tech priests experienced heretical calculations suggesting that chaos corruption followed predictable patterns, which meant it could be predicted and countered. In the Eye of Terror itself, cultists who had worshipped the dark gods for generations felt something shift in their connection to the warp, not weakened, not severed, just questioned. The four gods roared in fury, their manifestations flickering across 100 worlds, punishing those who dared doubt their supremacy. But doubt, once planted, is harder to kill than flesh. It spreads silently, grows in shadows, and changes everything it touches. WHIS had given the Imperium something more dangerous than power. He'd given them perspective, the ability to see their eternal nightmare from outside and recognize it as something that could, theoretically, possibly, end. The consequences were immediate and chaotic. On Terra, riots erupted as citizens processed revelation too large for their indoctrinated minds to handle. Some fell to their knees in prayer, thanking the Emperor for sending this blue-skinned angel with forbidden knowledge. Others screamed heresy, demanding WHIS immediate execution for daring to suggest the Imperium's foundational beliefs might be flawed. The Inquisition mobilized on scale not seen since the Age of Apostasy, Ordo Malleus demanding WHIS's head, Ordo Hereticus calling for his canonization as living saint, Ordo Xenos arguing he represented existential threat beyond classification. 3 assassination attempts were made before he'd even left the throne room. All 3 assassins stopped mid-strike, unable to reconcile their training with the cognitive dissonance of attacking something that registered simultaneously as greatest heresy and purest revelation. WHIS watched this chaos unfold with that same gentle sadness. He had tried to give them a gift. They were treating it like a bomb, which, in a sense, it was. "This is why I don't usually interfere in foreign universes," WHIS said to no one in particular, watching custodes argue among themselves about whether to protect him or execute him. Change, real fundamental change, is painful. Societies built on specific beliefs tend to implode when those beliefs are challenged, even if the challenge is accurate. He looked back at the Emperor one final time. "You wanted me to save humanity. I can't. Salvation requires choice, and I can't make that choice for billions of people. But I've shown them the choice exists. What they do with that knowledge, that's up to them. They can use it to slowly, painfully rebuild their civilization into something that doesn't feed eternal darkness. Or they can reject it, double down on suffering, and continue exactly as before. Both paths are possible now. Both paths are valid. The tragedy isn't which one they'll choose. The tragedy is that choosing at all will tear your Imperium apart." He began to walk toward the exit, staff clicking against golden floor, custodes parting uncertainly before him. Before he reached the Eternity Gate, the Emperor spoke one final time. His psychic voice was quiet now, stripped of rage and denial, carrying only exhaustion older than civilizations. "Will you return? Will you check on us, see if we chose correctly?" The question was plaintive, almost childlike, the plea of a being who had carried impossible weight for so long that he'd forgotten what hope felt like. WHIS stopped, considering his answer carefully. "Perhaps," he said finally, "in a few centuries, after the fires have burned themselves out, after you've either evolved or collapsed. I'm curious to see which you'll choose, whether you'll prove the Chaos Gods right and drown in familiar darkness, or prove them wrong and claw your way towards something better." He smiled, that gentle, sad smile. "I suspect it will be somewhere in between, messy, imperfect, bloody, but possibly, just possibly, slightly less grimdark than before. That's the best anyone can hope for in a universe this broken. Not salvation, not victory, just incremental improvement purchased at terrible cost." He resumed walking. The Eternity Gate opened before him, and the angel who had shown the 41st millennium its own reflection stepped back into darkness, leaving humanity to decide whether they had strength enough to look away from the abyss, or whether the abyss had already become too comfortable to abandon. 5 solar days after WHIS departed Terra, the Imperium began to fracture. Not collapse, not shatter. Fracture. Hairline cracks spreading through a structure built to endure anything except self-examination. Across 1,000,000 worlds, citizens who had spent their entire lives accepting suffering as inevitable began asking dangerous questions. Why must the Astronomicon consume 1,000 souls daily? Could there be alternatives? Why must every deviation be purged when deviation itself might offer solutions? The questions weren't revolutionary, weren't even particularly radical, but in an empire built on absolute certainty, uncertainty itself became the most dangerous weapon the Inquisition responded with predictable brutality, executing thought criminals by the thousands, burning entire hive levels suspected of harboring doubt. But for every heretic they killed, 3 more emerged. The revelation couldn't be unlearned, couldn't be purged from collective memory. WHIS had shown them the cage's bars. Now they couldn't stop seeing them, couldn't stop wondering if the door had been unlocked all along. On the eastern fringe, a chapter master named Alexander of the Crimson Templars did something unprecedented. He ordered his brothers to cease their purge of a planet where civilians had begun worshipping the Emperor not as distant tyrant, but as suffering father who deserved relief from his 10,000-year vigil. The Codex Astartes demanded these heretics burn. Tradition demanded compliance, but Alexander had felt WHIS' vision, had seen the Chaos God's true nature, and made a choice that would define his chapter's legacy. If the Emperor truly wanted endless suffering, he told his captains, he would not have sent the angel to show us another path. Half his chapter followed him, half declared him traitor and opened fire. The civil war lasted 6 weeks. When it ended, the Crimson Templars were split into 2 successor chapters, the Crimson Redeemers who followed Alexander's new philosophy, and the Crimson Martyrs who maintained orthodox belief. Neither side won. Both sides lost brothers they'd fought beside for centuries. That's what revelation costs in the Grimdark. There are no clean victories, only choices between different flavors of tragedy. In the Eye of Terror, something unexpected happened. A warband of the Black Legion, veterans who had fought in the long war since Horus fell, began experiencing doubt. Their connection to chaos didn't weaken, didn't sever, but it changed. They started perceiving the dark gods not as supreme beings worthy of worship, but as powerful entities worthy of negotiation. Their sorcerer lord, a being who had existed for 9,000 years sustained purely by warp corruption, tried something no Chaos Space Marine had attempted since the heresy. He said no to a direct command from Tzeentch, and he survived, not unscathed. The architect of fate punished him with visions that would have driven lesser beings permanently insane, but he lived, remained functional, retained his power. Word spread through chaos ranks like wildfire. The gods could be defied, not easily, not without cost, but they weren't absolute, weren't inevitable, weren't unstoppable forces of nature. They were tyrants, and tyrants, history proved, could fall if enough people stopped believing in their supremacy. The Long War entered a new phase, not humans versus chaos, but slaves versus masters on both sides of the conflict. The Emperor watched all of this from his golden throne, consciousness stretched thin across countless battlefronts, maintaining the Astronomicon while simultaneously witnessing his carefully constructed orthodoxy crumble. He could stop it, could issue psychic commands crushing dissent, could manifest his will through the most faithful servants, could enforce the old certainties through holy terror. But WHIS' words echoed in his mind. You've been dying. For so long you've forgotten what living looks like. For 10,000 years he had chosen suffering over uncertainty, control over change, maintenance over growth. And it had worked. Humanity survived. But at what cost? How many brilliant minds had been purged for suggesting alternatives? How many potential solutions had been burned as heresy? How many times had the Imperium chosen familiar darkness over uncertain light? The master of mankind, who had orchestrated human civilization since before recorded history, faced a revelation more terrifying than any demon. What if he had been wrong, not about everything, but about enough? Enough that his grand vision had calcified into self-perpetuating nightmare. On a feudal world in the Segmentum Pacificus, a young girl named Sarah, who would have been culled as witch, found herself protected by her village instead of burned. The revelation had reached even this backwater planet, and the citizens made a choice. They would train her, control her gifts, risk corruption for the possibility that psychers could be something other than ticking time bombs or fuel for the throne. She survived her first manifestation, learned to control her powers without becoming gateway for demons. It was small, fragile, one success among 10,000 failures elsewhere. But it was proof, actual evidence that alternatives existed, that the Imperium's brutal methodology wasn't the only option. When black ships arrived to collect her for the Scholastica Sicana, the villagers refused, not violently, not with weapons, simply stood between their protector and Imperial authorities and said no. The confrontation ended badly. The village burned. Sarah died alongside everyone she'd known. But across the sector, 17 other communities heard the story and made similar choices. Most failed. 3 succeeded. The Imperium's absolute control over psychers, maintained for 10 millennia, began to crack. Not shatter, just crack. But cracks spread if left untended. In the warp, the 4 Chaos Gods convened in a manner they hadn't since their births. Not unified, never unified, but aligned in recognizing a common threat. The angel had injured them in ways demons and bolters never could. He had damaged their mystique, their inevitability, the belief that fueled their power. We warned him, Tzeentch's voice echoed through impossible spaces, told him his interference would change nothing, and yet... The architect paused, calculating probabilities with increasing discomfort. The timeline has shifted, not toward salvation, never salvation, but toward unpredictability. I can no longer see all possible futures, too many variables, too many mortals choosing paths I hadn't calculated. Khorne's rage intensified, but beneath it lurked something alien, concern. Wars were being fought with hesitation now. Warriors questioning whether endless violence truly honored their god or merely fed a parasite. Nurgle's garden showed signs of unwelcome vitality. Slanesh's domain echoed with sounds of satisfaction, completeness, things that shouldn't exist in the palace of eternal hunger. The gods remained powerful, remained dangerous, but the cracks WHIS had revealed were spreading through their very essence. WHIS himself stood at the edge of the galaxy, preparing to leave this universe entirely. He could perceive the changes rippling outward from his interference, could see timelines branching in unprecedented directions. Some led to improvement, most led to new horrors. A few led to outcomes even he couldn't predict. Lord Beerus will be annoyed I was gone so long, he murmured, tapping his staff thoughtfully. Below him, the galaxy churned with conflict both old and new, the eternal WHIS, are complicated now by civil wars, philosophical schisms, and desperate attempts at innovation amid institutions designed to prevent innovation entirely. It was messy, painful, probably doomed to fail more often than succeed. Exactly what change looked like when applied to systems designed to resist it. He had shown them possibility, given them perspective, planted seeds of doubt in fertile soil of suffering. What grew from those seeds would determine whether this galaxy had any future beyond endless maintenance of eternal nightmare. Good luck, he said softly to worlds that couldn't hear him. You'll need it. Change is harder than stagnation. Hope is more painful than despair. But at least now you have the choice. Then WHIS vanished, stepping through dimensions back toward Universe 7, leaving the 41st millennium to determine its own fate. The Imperium didn't collapse in his wake, didn't transform into utopia, didn't suddenly abandon 10,000 years of doctrine overnight. Instead, it did something more realistic and more human. It struggled, fought with itself, made mistakes, tried new approaches, failed spectacularly at most of them, succeeded unexpectedly at a few. The Grimdark didn't end. How could it? The warp still existed. The gods still fed on emotion. Humanity still faced extinction from 1,000 different directions. But now, scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, people fought that darkness with something they hadn't possessed before. Not hope. Hope was still dangerous in a universe where chaos fed on such emotions, but something simpler and more sustainable. Determination. The grim, stubborn refusal to accept that suffering was the only option. They would probably lose. Statistics. suggested failure more often than success. But maybe, just maybe, if enough people refused to accept inevitable darkness, if enough souls chose difficult change over comfortable stagnation, then centuries from now, when that strange blue-skinned angel returned to check on them, he might find a galaxy that was still grimdark, still violent, still suffering. But perhaps, incrementally, measurably, less so than before. That was the real gift WHIS left behind. Not salvation, not solutions, just the possibility that the 41st millennium's endless nightmare could become, through terrible effort and catastrophic cost, a slightly better nightmare. In the grimdark of the far future, that was as close to hope as anyone could reasonably expect.